Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first 13 verses of the 10th chapter of the first book of Kings. Herein we read of the dialogue between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, the latter of whom actually traveled quite a distance, some 1,000 miles. The kingdom of Sheba was located in modern Yemen, or the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, and they were not a Semitic people. They were descendants of Cush, who was a descendant of Ham, although that's not necessarily what's most important. What's most important in the historical context was that Solomon expanded the commercial contacts of Israel to scopes never before seen and never before seen again. And Sheba had a illustrious commercial network which spanned the range of Syria to Africa to India. So she came 1,000 miles to hear him. His wisdom, the reputation of his wisdom had reached her ear some 1,000 miles away, and that just goes to show in the age before instant communication how extensive his reputation for wisdom must have been. And she, without reading too much into the passage we're going to read, she asked him a host of perplexing questions, none of which are too complex for him to answer. So she leaves with a witness of not only Solomon's wisdom, but the Elohim who had endowed him with such. So the opening verse reads, "And the Queen of Sheba heard of the report of Solomon concerning the name of Yahweh, and came to try him with hard questions." Now the Arabic people have a rich tradition of proverbs, so they had some tradition of wisdom. They were not an uncivilized people. The kingdom of Sheba, which was ruled, had many queens. This queen is unnamed, but she's not the only one. They had a history of being ruled by female queens. She came all this way to having heard the report or the reputation which had spread of Solomon for his wisdom. So she's going to come and see what all the hype is all about. She's going to bring her arsenal of complex questions, and she's going to answer them to her satisfaction, as we read. "And she came to Jerusalem with a very great company, with camels that bore spices, very much gold, and precious stones. And she came to Solomon, and she spoke with him about all that was in her heart." So these items, the gold, spices, etc., precious stones, would have been native imports or exports, rather. They would have been native to the land of Sheba. So she came in full royal regalia and in all the pomp and fanfare which accompanied royalty wherever they go. And there's no reference of how this arrangement was made. We don't know if she invited herself or if Solomon invited her. The inference suggests that she took it on her own initiative to travel all this way. She may have let him know via the writing of letter that she intended to stay, because Solomon did arrange appropriate regal settings to receive this guest of honor and dignity. And she spoke with him about that all was in her heart. So she was not an unintelligent woman. She had questions that she couldn't answer, but she wanted to see if maybe someone else could, and that's the reason why they're gathered. "And Solomon answered all her questions. There was no matter hidden from the king that he did not make known to her." So all her questions, that means every single one. The three-letter word all entails a universality of scope or dimension. So there was no question that was too complex or too paradoxical or anything else for him. And there was nothing that she didn't know that she expressed, wanting to make known and understood that he didn't know. So his wisdom was more than it was hyped up to be. She heard of the wisdom, then she came to see herself. Seeing is believing, and she went straight to the source and found out for herself the hard way, because she had to travel some 1,000 miles. And in fact, the distance that she traveled is made note of by the Savior in the 12th chapter of Matthew, where he commends the Queen of Sheba for traveling the distance she did to seek out the wisdom of Solomon, while condemning his Pharisaical antagonist for not making the most of the one who was greater than Solomon while he was in their midst. "And the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the house that he had built." The house would have been his palace, which he built alongside the temple. These were both expressions of wisdom, the architectural intricacy of it all. And she saw all the wisdom. She not only heard it, but saw it in the ornate architecture, in the settings in which he dwelled and entertained her. And so the building, Solomon was very much a builder. He built the temple, he built a palace, he built all these strategically necessary fortifications throughout his kingdom, and he strengthened the walls and all that stuff. So he was a builder, and his building was an expression of his wisdom. And the food on his table, and the seating of his servants, and the service of his waiters, and their attire, and his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings, which he offered in the house of Yahweh. And there was no more spirit in her. So they would have dined on royal delicacies. This would have been extravagant entertainment, royalty, hosting royalty. So nothing but the best would have been present or even allowed at that occasion. And she takes note of the well-organized and well-attired staff and servants that he has at his disposal, the cupbearers, etc. And she took note of the burnt offerings which he offered in the house of Yahweh. So this visit wouldn't have been exclusively in the palace. She would have accompanied him to witness the worship and ritual of the Hebrew people, which he went through the burnt offerings. That was one of the functions for which that was one of the reasons that the temple existed, to make the animal sacrifices for atonement. Then she said to the king, "The word I heard in my own land about your words and wisdom was true, but I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And see, I have not been told the half. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the report which I heard." So the information which had prompted her investigation turns out to be not even telling her a fraction of what she just found out, having taken the initiative of that investigation to go up for herself and to see what all this man is all about, what he has to offer, how wise exactly he is. And she finds out the direct way, the best way, which is to come with an arsenal of loaded questions, the complexities of which are not beyond his range to answer simply and comprehensibly. And so seeing is believing. You can, reputation, you can't get the full picture of someone else unless you actually meet them and engage them and interact with them. So seeing is believing in this case, and that's very much what her words indicate, that she had heard, but now that she saw, she really knew. "Blessed are your men, and blessed are these your servants, who stand continually before you, who are hearing your wisdom." So she, a queen, considered it a blessing to be a servant in his household, to have direct exposure and intimate accessibility to his wisdom, which he freely bestowed upon any and all who came into his path. She had traveled a great distance. It would have been an expensive endeavor to travel some 1,000 miles via camel and horse or anything else in the ancient world. So, but, she, having come all this way, having left her own palace in her own pomp, in her own splendor, she is almost envious, although she said not quite. That's kind of an unnecessarily extreme interpretation. She thinks positively. She says, "Blessed are the servants," but she may perhaps somewhat secretly envy them. We don't want to charge any malicious motives to her that aren't explicitly indicated in the text. And she gave, "Blessed be Yahweh your Elohim, who delighted in you, to put you on the throne of Israel, because Yahweh has loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king, to do justice and righteousness." So she leaves with a witness of the Elohim of Israel, whose covenant name, God the Father, is Yahweh, and he delighted in Solomon. He elevated him to the throne because that was an expression of his enduring and eternal love for Israel. She phrases it, loved Israel forever. So his love for Israel remains undying. It is there to this day and will be to the end times, even as Israel ceased to be a nation and the Jews were scattered through the diaspora throughout the four corners of the earth. Maybe not that quite extensive or that far, but his love is as eternal as the one from whence it comes. and the reason that he made him king was to do justice and righteousness. Now we also read a manifestation of his wisdom in action when administering justice in reference to the two prostitutes, each contending for the ownership claim of one son, which he settles in the 3rd chapter by ordering a servant to slice the child in half and give half to each of them. And the real mother will rather prefer to see the baby survive intact than to have it be killed. And the false mother, the one who had lost her child, it turns out she fell asleep on him and killed him or something of that sort. She reveals her true false nature by agreeing to Solomon's issue, and the true mother reveals herself no mother would want that to happen to her child. And she gave the king 120 kickers of gold, and very many spices, and precious stones. Never again did so many spices come as the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. So we're not familiar with the measurement, but we gather it was a substantial weight of the 120 kikers, or we're not even entirely sure how to pronounce that, but it was an extraordinary amount of gold, and the archaeological excavations of Solomon's Jerusalem suggest that the accounts of the wealth, the influx of the gold which poured into Solomon during his reign were not exaggerated. This was an extraordinary wealthy kingdom and king. And the spices would have been native to her land of Yemen, or rather Sheba. But so great was the extent and so bountiful was the outflow that there had never been anything like it, nor would there be anything like it ever seen again, the extent to which she endowed. And in the 13th and closing passage, we read that Solomon reciprocated her generosity. But that's we only got 2 more verses in between now and then. So the 11th verse reads, "And also the ships of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought almug wood, a great many, and precious stones from Ophir." Hiram would have been the king of the nation to the north, Phoenicia, which corresponds to the modern country of Lebanon. These were a seafaring people. Even though the Israelites were a coastal people, they never quite became a seafaring people. That expertise and craft was acquired by the Phoenicians to the north. And Hiram's father was on friendly terms with David, as was Hiram to, if not his son, then certainly the same one. Might have been a common name of that dynasty. He was on friendly terms and engaged in extensive commercial contacts and alliances, diplomatic alliances with King Solomon. And Almug wood, the land of Phoenicia, was famous for its cedar woods, and this was built in much of his incorporated in much of his building projects, his temple, his palace, and even David, whose palace was exceedingly less grandiose than his son Solomon, said, "I dwell in a house of cedar, while Yahweh dwells in a tent." This is his expression for his great outstanding desire to be the one to build Solomon's temple, but he is rejected and told that he has too much blood on his hand. He's going to leave the task to his son and successor, who will not be so stained by the blood of others. David was a warrior king. Solomon expanded Israel's hegemony and influence through the path of commerce, diplomacy, and trade, and his name Solomon is derived from the Hebrew word shalom, which translates as more than mere peace. Really, there's no equivalent term for it in the English language. Shalom expresses a wellness of being and a spiritual and material prosperity. And also the ships... And the king made steps of the almug wood for the house of Yahweh, and for the king's house, also lyres and harps for singers. No such almug wood has come or been seen to this day. So the almug wood might have been something special or separate from the cedar wood, but in any case, he used both to build the steps and foundations to both the temple and his palace, and also musical instruments would have been prolific throughout wherever royalty was in ancient and medieval and even modern times. And the almug wood was to an unprecedented and unduplicated extent. We read in the final sentence, "No such almug wood has come or been seen to this day." And King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, before what he gave her, according to the hand of King Solomon. And she turned and went away to her land, she and her servants. So their business is thus concluded, but not before Solomon reciprocates some of the generosity she shows. We don't have any detail to the extent or nature of these gifts, but we can imagine that Solomon had the most substantial bounty out of any ruler at that time. So it in all likelihood was equal to or exceedingly greater than that which the Queen of Sheba had given to him, and he had given to her something beyond measure of price, which was the answers to these questions which were perplexing her. So that was an irreplaceable and priceless gift. So what we witness in here is a manifestation of the often overlooked and tragically neglected evangelical mission and charter of the Abrahamic people, as espoused in Genesis 12:1-3. They were to be a witness to all the nations of the Yahweh who had separated them and chose them for the specific purpose of being a visible and verbal testimony to his nature and character. And that's what we witnessed. Solomon, he really expanded the international influence of Hebrew to such extents as was never before witnessed in their monarchical phase, but with the danger of commercial contacts and international indulgences came the creeping in of foreign ideas. And eventually in the 11th chapter we read that he married too many wives who he loved too much, and he essentially allowed them to set up shop with their idolatrous edifices, and that led to his premature death and downfall, and ultimately splintered the kingdom, after which time the evangelical mandate would retreat because they were contending for their own security. They were a divided nation. There was one covenant people, but two covenant nations. But there's the Chronicle account. I also did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston, 2 Chronicles 9:1-12. It's a verse shorter than this one. But the chapter which precedes, now much of the material which comes in the 10th chapter of 1 Kings is mimicked or duplicated in that. They detail the extent of his wealth and his prestige and all the rest, but the Chronicle accounts eliminate the mention of his succumbing to idolatry because that was not aligned with the chronicler's intended emphasis, which just was to write from a priestly perspective. He almost whitewashes the sins of David and Solomon. There's no mention of Bathsheba or Uriah or anything like that. So what we read at the close of the 11th chapter, we read at the close of the 10th chapter in Chronicles, that being that the rest of his history and recordings are recorded in the book of Nathan the seer, etc., etc. But I also did one on 1 Kings 11. You can type in that. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.